The air in the tower did not move. It was a solid thing, a block of cold carved from the stone of, saturated with the smell of damp lime and human resignation. For last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, each breath was an act of archaeology, digging through layers of stale memories trapped within the circular walls. Light was a rumor, a pale suggestion that bled through a single arrow slit high above, never truly reaching the floor where he and his lieutenants existed. Their world was a monochrome etching of gray stone, the black of their own shadows, and the faint, ghostly white of the symbols they had scratched into the walls with a nail or a shard of bone, or perhaps just the sheer force of their will. A chalice, a triangle, a sun with a human face, prayers and frustrations made permanent. They were ghosts haunting their own living bodies. This place was a stomach, slowly digesting them. Years had blurred, seasons marked only by the shifting quality of the cold that seeped from the Loire River valley and into their bones. But a single memory remained sharp, a shard of glass in the soft pulp of their despair. A memory of other men, different questions, and a promise made not in the open court of a king, but in the hushed confidence of the church itself. Before we follow the echo of that promise into the Vatican's most guarded chambers, consider joining this exploration. Subscribe, and you will not miss the discovery of the document that rewrites this entire history of betrayal. The others were nearby, islands of silence in the same stagnant sea. Preceptor of Normandy, his face now a mask of hollows and angles, would sometimes trace the carved lines on the wall, his finger following a path only he understood. The Visitor General rarely spoke, his silence a heavier stone than any in the tower. They had confessed. Under unspeakable pressures orchestrated by the functionaries of King Philip IV of France, they had all admitted to spitting on the cross, to obscene kisses, to heresy. The words had been put in their mouths like sour communion wafers, lies they were forced to swallow to make the pain stop. But the memory that kept them from madness was not of the torture racks. It was of a different proceeding, a clandestine hearing within these very walls. Not long after their arrival here, before the silence had become permanent, men had come. They were not Philip's brutal inquisitors. They were princes of the church, cardinals dispatched by Pope Clement V himself. They had arrived not with instruments of pain, but with parchment and ink and a notary. In this very room had knelt, not in terror but in penance. He had recounted the horrors of his confession, explaining it was extracted through torment, a desperate bid to survive. He clarified the nature of the secret initiation rites, rituals that had been twisted by their accusers into blasphemy. He spoke of the spitting, not as an act of apostasy, but as a simulated test of faith, a symbolic denial with the mouth while the heart remained true, a grim preparation for capture by Saracens. He remembered the face of Cardinal, a man whose eyes held not the fire of a zealot but the weary calculus of a politician. He remembered the scratching of the quill as the notary, a man named Robert, recorded every word. He and the others had abjured the heresies they had been forced to admit. They had asked for the pardon of the Church, and in the name of Pope Clement V, the cardinals had granted it. They had been declared reconciled with the faith, their sins absolved, and were allowed to receive the sacrament again. It was all written down, a formal record, a parchment that was their proof of innocence, their ticket back to the world. Then the cardinals left, and the silence returned deeper than before. The parchment, their salvation, had vanished with them, absorbed back into the immense, silent machinery of the papacy. The king's guards remained. The food was still slop. The door remained bolted. Weeks bled into months, months into years. The absolution felt like a dream. Had it happened? The shared looks between the leaders confirmed it. It was real. The document existed, but where? Why had the Pope, their ultimate protector, absolved them in secret only to abandon them to the king's vengeance? The hope that had flared so brightly that day had slowly cooled into a strange, hard ember of faith. They were not heretics. Rome knew it. God knew it. The parchment was their witness wherever it was. Tonight the damp air felt different. It carried a new vibration, a subtle tremor that ran through the stone floor. It was not the familiar tread of the guards with their evening ration of bread and water. This was heavier, slower. The sound of multiple feet shod in leather, not iron. A key, monstrous and ancient, groaned in the lock. The bolt, thick as a man's wrist, was drawn back with a shriek of protesting metal that scraped the inside of their skulls. The heavy oak door swung inward, not with the usual careless slam, but with a deliberate, almost reverent weight. In the opening stood figures cloaked in darkness, their forms silhouetted by the flickering torchlight from the corridor beyond. These were not jailers. Their bearing was different, erect, certain. One of them held a lantern high, and the sudden, aggressive light made the prisoners flinch, throwing their hands up to shield eyes that had forgotten the sun. The light caught the deep red of a cardinal's cassock, the glint of a pectoral cross. They had come again, after all these years. His heart, a slow and tired drum, beat a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He pushed himself up, his old joints screaming in protest. Was this it? Was this the moment the Pope finally asserted his authority? Was this the deliverance promised on that lost parchment? Or was it something else entirely, a final chapter to a story they thought had already ended? The man in the lead, his face obscured by shadow, held up not a royal decree, but a papal bull, its wax seal catching the light like a drop of blood. The seal on the papal bull was not wax. It was fossilized blood, a dark scab on the pristine skin of the parchment. It promised nothing good. Felt the hope in his chest collapse like a lung punctured by a blade. The man holding the document, his face a geography of political weariness, was not one of the cardinals who had offered them absolution all those years ago. This was a new face, belonging to a different, colder chapter. The voice was dry, a rustle of dead leaves. It belonged to a kinsman of the Pope, a man whose elevation to cardinal was a testament to loyalty, not piety. He did not look at them as men, but as items on an inventory to be processed. By the authority of the bull Vox in, you are summoned from this place. His Holiness, Pope Clement in his wisdom, has seen fit to dissolve the order of the temple. Your case is now concluded. Concluded. The word hung in the dead air, a spiderweb thick with dust and lies. His gaze drifted past the cardinal too. In the flickering, aggressive torchlight's face was a study in stillness. The hope had vanished from his eyes too, replaced by something harder, something familiar. It was the look of a man on a battlefield who has just understood the totality of the betrayal. The moment he realizes the reinforcements are not coming, and the flag he fights for has already been sold. They had been absolved. They possessed God's forgiveness and the Pope's pardon, locked away on a scroll gathering dust in some Vatican vault. And it meant nothing. That secret parchment was a prayer whispered in a hurricane. This bull, read aloud in their dungeon, was the storm itself. Shuffled his feet, a small, scraping sound of surrender. He seemed to shrink, to fold into himself, ready to accept this final, quiet degradation. But Anne did not move. An invisible current passed between them, a shared lifetime of oaths and duties solidifying in this final moment. They were not just prisoners. They were the Grand Master and the Preceptor of Normandy. They were the living embodiment of an order that had just been declared dead. "You will be taken to Paris," Cardinal continued, his voice devoid of any inflection. "Before the legates of the Pope and the good people of the city, you will reaffirm your confessions. You will be sentenced to perpetual imprisonment, a mercy considering your confessed heresies. A mercy, a life sentence in a monastic cell, a quiet fading into obscurity while Philip the Fair counted the Templar gold he had seized. The king would get his public victory, the Pope would wash his hands of the affair, and the world would forget. They would be remembered as the disgraced leaders of a blasphemous cult. All they had to do was repeat the lies one last time. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, felt the immense gravitational pull of that offer, the warmth of a bed, a full meal, the sun on his face, an end to the damp and the cold. He had to weigh it against a truth that no one seemed to want, a truth whose only reward would be agony. He looked at the symbols scratched on the wall, the faint outlines of their faith etched in stone. They had kept that faith in the dark. Could he deny it now in the light? The guards moved forward, their chinking a rhythm of finality. They reached for his arm. He did not resist. As they pulled him to his feet, the stiff fabric of his rags scraping against his skin, he felt a strange clarity descend. The years of doubt, of clinging to the memory of the parchment, of hoping for a justice that was never coming, it all burned away, leaving a single, cold point of purpose. They were led out of the tower. The spiral staircase was a dizzying descent into a world they no longer knew. Each step was an agony for atrophied muscles. The air in the corridor tasted sharp, laced with torch smoke and the distant smell of the river, a scent so complex and alive it was almost painful. Their shadows, long and distorted, danced on the stone walls ahead of them, misshapen puppets pulled by the guards' lanterns. As they emerged from the fortress gate into the raw March night, the sky was a revelation. A vast, star-pricked blackness, utterly unlike the contained darkness of their cell. The wind cut at their faces. For 7 years their world had been a stone circle 20 feet across. Now it was limitless. And in that infinite space, understood that his life was no longer his own. It belonged to the order, to the 2 centuries of men who had died in the dust of the Holy Land, to the novices who had taken oaths he himself had administered. His mind did not dwell on the flames that he knew now were inevitable. It slipped backward, past the torture, past the trial, past the arrest. It landed on a memory of a different kind of darkness. A chapel, lit only by a single candle. He was a young man, kneeling, his hand on a sacred text. He remembered the words of the oath he had taken, the promise that was the true heart of the temple. A promise not of wealth or power, but of something far more dangerous. He had promised to guard a secret, even unto death. A secret the church and the king wanted buried more than anything. And in Paris, on the scaffold they were building for him, he would finally honor that oath. What was the truth he was willing to burn for? What had the Templars truly discovered in Jerusalem that made them so great and ultimately so threatening? The journey to Paris was in drowning. After 7 years submerged in the silent, gray liquid of the keep, they were hauled into the air and forced to breathe a world they had forgotten. The cart's wheels groaned, a sound that competed with the wind, the rustle of new spring leaves, and the distant, maddeningly normal bleating of sheep. Every sensation was an assault. Wedged between a guard and the rough-sawn planks of the cart, kept his eyes closed for the first hour. The light was too loud, the colors too violent. He could feel the sun on his face, not as a gentle warmth but as a physical weight, a hot palm pressed against his skin. Sat opposite him, his posture impossibly straight. He did not flinch from the light. He stared out at the passing countryside, at the peasants who stopped their work in the fields to gawk at the grim procession, his expression unreadable. Was he memorizing the green of the fields, the blue of the sky? Or was he looking through them at a landscape of memory, at the rolling hills of Normandy where he had once been master? The guards spoke little, their silence a professional courtesy offered to condemned men. They were furniture in this final act, functional and unthinking. As they drew closer to Paris, the world grew thicker, denser. The air became a stew of wood smoke, roasting meat, human sweat, and the foul miasma of the river Seine. The sounds layering into a cacophony that vibrated in its teeth. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of merchants, the rumble of 1,000 conversations, the cry of a baby. It was the sound of life, vibrant and chaotic, and it made the silence of their tomb and feel like a betrayal. They had been erased from this world while it continued to churn, heedless of their absence. They were not taken to a palace or a proper prison. They were brought to a hastily erected platform before the great, unfinished cathedral of Dame. Its stone, crawling with saints and gargoyles, loomed over the square, a silent, unblinking witness. A crowd had already gathered, a restless sea of faces, drawn by the promise of spectacle. These were not the faces of enemies. They were worse. They were the faces of the curious, the bored, the morbidly entertained. They had come to see the monsters, the fallen angels of Christendom, and to hear them confess their sins one last time. On the platform sat the papal legates, their crimson robes a splash of arrogant color against the gray stone. Cardinal, another of Clement's relatives, presided, his face a soft, pampered mask of solemnity. This was the final piece of theater, designed by King Philip to cement his victory. The Templars, broken and humbled, would publicly admit their guilt. The Pope's representatives would grant the king's merciful sentence of life in prison. The gold would remain in Philip's treasury. The Templar lands would be gifted to thee, after the king had taken his considerable cut, and the inconvenient matter of the most powerful military order in Europe would be closed. Was led forward first. He was a ghost, a hollowed-out man whose spirit had fled long ago. He stumbled, his eyes on the ground, and when the charges were read, the denial of Christ, the worship of an idol, the institutionalized sodomy, he mumbled his agreement. His voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the crowd's murmur. He accepted his sentence of perpetual imprisonment like a man accepting a blanket on a cold night. Followed a mirror image of brokenness. He too confessed, his head bowed, his once proud shoulders slumped in utter defeat. They were led away, disappearing back into the obscurity the king had designed for them. Then it was turn. He walked to the center of the platform, not with the shuffle of a prisoner, but with the measured tread of a commander reviewing his troops. He looked out over the sea of faces, his gaze sweeping past them to the spires of the city beyond. The legate began to read the familiar litany of heresies. A strange silence fell over the square. Was not looking down, he was not mumbling, he was waiting. When the reader paused, expecting the confession, drew a deep breath. "I have heard what you have said," his voice rang out, clear and strong, a bell tolling over the stunned quiet. "And I have seen the fate of my brothers who spoke from fear. But now, at this final moment of my life, when I must fear lying above all else, I declare before heaven and earth that we are innocent. The order is pure and holy. The confessions were lies, wrung from us by the agony of torture and the terror of death." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The legates stiffened in their chairs, their masks of solemnity cracking to reveal shock and fury. Cardinal half rose, his hand fluttering as if to snatch the words from the air, but was not finished. He turned, his eyes finding it was not a plea, it was a summons. Now. The guards pushed him forward. His legs, stiff and old, found a new strength. The aches from the cart, the screaming of his joints, all of it vanished, burned away by the fire had just lit. He walked past the stunned legates, past the open-mouthed clerks, and stood beside his preceptor. He was no longer a prisoner. He was the Grand Master. "What my brother has said is the truth." His voice boomed, deeper and rougher than the sound of stone grinding on stone. It was the voice of a man who had commanded armies and advised kings. "I admit the guilt of my shame. I confess to the crimes imputed to me, but it was only to save myself from the horrific pains of the rack and to appease the king. The order of the temple is innocent. I have committed a great sin in accusing it. It deserves not this infamy, but a place of honor among the defenders of Christ." He raised his manacled hands, not in surrender, but as if holding a sacred relic. "I see my final judgment here. But I will not buy a few more miserable years by repeating the foulest of lies. I renounce my confession. I choose to die." Chaos erupted. The carefully constructed stage play fell apart. The crowd was no longer a passive audience. It was a roaring, confused beast. Shouts of blasphemers, mixed with cries of innocent. The papal legates were paralyzed, their authority dissolving before their eyes. They had the power to sentence, but not to execute. Their procedure required deliberation, consultation with the Pope. This public recantation was a disaster, a wrench thrown into the delicate gears of Philip's political machine. But King Philip was not a man who allowed for deliberation when his will was. His men, a separate authority from the church's guards, were already moving. They were not priests or clerks. They were soldiers and officers of the crown. They shoved their way onto the platform, their faces grim with purpose. There was no hesitation, no consultation. The king's order, though unspoken, was absolute. The spectacle had been ruined. It would be replaced by a different, more brutal one. The legates, flustered and impotent, handed the two men over to the provost of Paris. It was a washing of hands, a desperate attempt to distance the church from what was about to happen, and were seized. The promises of mercy, the sentence of perpetual imprisonment, all evaporated in the heat of their defiance. They were dragged from the platform through the screaming, surging crowd, caught a glimpse of the sky, a brilliant, piercing blue. He felt no fear. He felt a profound, chilling peace. The years of rot the agony of the torture chamber, the gnawing uncertainty, it had all been a long, slow walk to this single, perfect moment of truth. They were not taken back to a cell. They were taken toward the river, to a small island in the Seine. It was late afternoon on March 18th, 1314. As they were marched through the streets, they could hear the frantic sounds of construction, the hammering of nails, the stacking of wood. Philip the Fair would not wait for morning. He would not allow the words they had spoken to linger in the Parisian air overnight. He would burn the truth out of the sky before the sun went down. But as the pyre was being built, one question must have consumed the minds of those who had heard them. What secret, what truth about the temple was so profound that it made a death by fire preferable to a life of silence? The wood was green. It had been cut that afternoon from the royal gardens, its sap still weeping in sticky, fragrant tears down the bark. This was not a pyre built for a clean, quick end. It was a pyre built for smoke, for choking, for a slow and agonizing spectacle. As the guards bound to the stake, his back pressed against the rough, unseasoned lumber, he could see the sun setting behind the towers of the royal palace. It was not a gentle fading. The sky was a bleeding wound. Streaks of violent orange and bruised purple smeared across the horizon, as if the day itself was being murdered. The crowd gathered on the banks of the Seine was a single, many-headed animal, its breath a low murmur, its eyes 1,000 hungry points of light in the deepening twilight. They were pressed shoulder to shoulder, a living wall between the condemned and the rest of the world. Was tied to a stake beside him, his face turned towards the silhouette of Dame. Even now his posture was one of defiance, his chin lifted. He met's gaze, and in that final, silent exchange there was no fear. There was only the grim satisfaction of a pact fulfilled, a duty brought to its terrible, necessary conclusion. The ropes bit into his flesh, a coarse, final embrace. The provost of Paris, a man whose face was a blank slate of bureaucratic duty, held up a torch. The flame sputtered, a tiny, defiant star against the coming night. This was the moment, the end of the story. But for his mind refused the ending. It slipped its leash, unspooling backward past the years of darkness, past the agony of the rack, pulling him into a memory so vivid it smelled of dust and myrrh. He was not on an island in the Seine. He was deep beneath the Paris temple, in a vault whose existence was known only to the Grand Master and his most trusted circle. He was younger, his beard still more black than gray, his shoulders straight with purpose, not bent by age and torture. Before him, the then Grand Master, a man whose bones now lay somewhere in the dust of Acre, unsealed a lead cylinder. The hiss of air breaking the seal was the only sound in the chamber, which was lit by a single oil lamp that threw their shadows up the stone walls like giants guarding a secret. Inside the cylinder was not gold, not a jewel, but a scroll of papyrus, so brittle it seemed a breath could turn it to dust. It was wrapped around a piece of dark, polished wood. It was not a holy relic in the traditional sense. There were no splinters of the cross, no bones of a saint. The document was a genealogy, but it did not trace the lineage of a king. It traced a bloodline through the records of the Jerusalem temple, records the Knights had unearthed during their first decades in the Holy Land, records the Roman world believed had been utterly destroyed. It was a testament, written not in Latin or Greek, but in a clear, precise Aramaic. A testament that spoke of a marriage, of children, of a legacy not of spirit but of flesh. Had not let him read it all. He had only been shown a single section, his finger tracing a line of names that sent a tremor of sacrilegious awe through the young. This was the heart of the order's true purpose. They were not merely guardians of a road or bankers to a continent. They were guardians of a truth so profound it would unravel the fabric of the world they served. They were protecting a bloodline. The text called it not a cup, but a royal blood. "We do not worship this," had whispered, his voice like stones rolling in a deep cave. "We protect it. We protect the possibility it represents." That God's story on earth did not end on a cross, but continued in the veins of men and women. To reveal it would be to burn the world. To let it be forgotten would be a greater sin. The memory was so real he could feel the cool, dry air of the vault on his skin. A sharp, acrid smell snapped him back to the present. The torch. A soldier was dabbing pitch onto the base of the pyre. The crowd inhaled as one, a great collective gasp of anticipation. His gaze swept over them, these Parisians who had come for a show. They saw a heretic, a monster, a failed crusader. They did not see the guardian. They could not comprehend what he was dying to protect. He looked at Philip's palace, a dark mass against the dying light. The king thought he had won. He had the Templar gold, their land, their archives, but he did not have this. The innermost secrets had been moved decades ago, scattered across Europe in a web of hidden, entrusted to men whose names were never written down. Philip had seized a body, but the soul of the order was already gone, hidden in plain sight. The torch was thrown. The green wood hissed and sputtered, refusing to catch. Then a bundle of dry straw at the base roared to life. A wave of heat washed over him, a prelude to the agony to come. Smoke, thick and oily, billowed upwards, a foul curtain rising on the final act. Began to cough, a racking, desperate sound. Through the smoke, fixed his eyes on the palace. He would not scream, he would not beg, he would give the king one last piece of the truth. He filled his lungs with the foul, choking air, and as the first real flames began to lick at his feet, he unleashed his voice, not in a cry of pain, but in a ringing, terrible proclamation that cut through the roar of the fire and the murmur of the crowd. "Pope Clement, King Philip, before this year is out, I summon you to the tribunal of God for the wrongs you have done us." His voice did not crack. It was the voice of a grand master giving his final command. The flames leaped higher, devouring his legs, turning his coarse robes to black ash. The pain was a white-hot ocean, absolute and all-consuming, but his will was a fortress. He could feel his life being burned away, rendered down to its essential element. "God will avenge our death," he roared, his face now invisible behind a shimmering curtain of heat and smoke. The crowd fell silent, stunned. This was not the pathetic whimper of a dying heretic. It was a curse, a prophecy, a judgment delivered from a throne of fire. For a final, lucid moment before consciousness was consumed, did not see the faces of his executioners or the towers of Paris. He saw the scroll, the line of Aramaic names, the sacred, terrifying bloodline. He had kept the oath. The secret was safe. The fire took him, but his last words hung in the Parisian night, sharp and cold and heavy with the weight of a coming reckoning. Had a dying man simply screamed his rage at the sky, or had the true, hidden power of the temple just been unleashed upon the world. The fire died with the slow, reluctant stubbornness of green wood. Embers hissed where they fell into puddles on the damp ground of the islet, each sound a final punctuation mark on a life. For a long time after's last cry tore through the twilight, no one moved. The crowd on the riverbank stood as if frozen, their morbid curiosity sated and replaced by a colder, deeper apprehension. The curse, spoken from a crucible of unimaginable pain, was not a plea or a threat. It had the weight of a pronouncement, a stone dropped into the smooth surface of history, its ripples destined to travel. The provost of Paris, his face illuminated by the sullen orange glow of the pyre, made the sign of the cross, an unconscious, jerky gesture from a man who dealt in royal decrees, not divine judgment. He ordered his men to douse the remains, to break apart the blackened bones, and cast every last fragment into the Seine, lest the morbidly pious collect them as relics. He wanted to erase the event, but the words, like the foul smoke, had already drifted over the city, seeping into the stones of the palace and the private chambers of the powerful. In his palace on the Loire, King Philip the Fair did not watch the burning. He did not need to. He had seen the defiance on the platform, the moment his perfectly orchestrated political theater had combusted into genuine heresy. A messenger, pale and breathless, brought the news of the final curse. Philip listened without expression, his famously handsome features as still and cold as the marble saints on the cathedral facade. He stood by a window overlooking the river, though the island of the execution was hidden from his view. His chief minister, a man whose mind was a complex abacus of finance and political leverage, stood waiting for a reaction, for an order. But the king gave none. He simply stared into the darkness, at the reflection of the candlelight on the glass, a ghostly crown hovering above his head. He had crushed the most powerful military order in Christendom. He had filled his treasury with their gold. He had bent the papacy to his will. The ravings of a tortured, dying old man were the inconsequential sparks from a fire he had already extinguished, or so he told himself. That night, the king did not sleep. He heard the wind whispering against the stained glass, and it seemed to be counting. 1 year, 1 pope, 1 king. The summons arrived for the Pope first. Just over 1 month after the pyre was lit, on the 20th of April, Pope Clement V lay dying in the castle of. The grand tribunal of God, it seemed, was not a metaphor. He had fled Avignon, a city choked with rumors of the curse, hoping the country air would mend a body consumed from within by a sickness the papal physicians could not name. They called it dysentery, but it was a rot that mirrored the state of his soul. His opulent chambers, draped in silk and gold thread, smelled of decay and fear. He was haunted, not by the ghost of, but by the memory of his own weakness. He had been the shepherd, and he had handed his flock to the wolf, all for the promise of security and the quiet life in France, away from the viper's nest of Roman politics. In his final, lucid moments, delirious with fever, he was said to have screamed about a fire, about the light being too bright. He died alone, his cardinals already squabbling over his succession. As if to add a final, divine comment on his reign, a violent thunderstorm broke over that night. Lightning struck the church where his body lay in state, and the resulting fire consumed much of the building, charring the Pope's mortal remains almost beyond recognition. He had been judged, not by a conclave of his peers, but by fire and water, the very elements that had claimed the man he condemned. The news of Clement's grotesque end rippled through the courts of Europe. One was down. The public, who had watched the execution with a mixture of fear and fascination, now watched the king. The curse was no longer a madman's prophecy. It was a tally. Philip the Fair, the Iron King, proceeded as if nothing had changed. He projected an aura of unshakable control. Yet his world was beginning to fray at the edges. That same year, a monstrous scandal erupted within his own family, the Tour affair. His three daughters-in-law, the wives of his sons and future kings of France, were accused and found guilty of adultery. The scandal was public, humiliating and catastrophic for the royal lineage. The men who had been the architects of the Templar trials, the masters of extracting confessions, were now forced to turn their grim tools upon the princesses of the realm. The dynasty Philip had fought so ruthlessly to secure was now tainted at its very source. His kingdom, which had seemed an impenetrable fortress, was being hollowed out from the inside, not by an invading army, but by whispers, lust, and betrayal. The Iron King was discovering the limits of his power. He could burn men, but he could not command loyalty or stop the whispers that followed him everywhere, whispers that carried name. The final judgment came in the autumn. The forests around Fontainebleau were ablaze with the colors of fall, the air crisp and clean. King Philip, an avid huntsman, sought solace in the chase, a place where the world was reduced to the simple clarity of predator and prey. One day in late October, while pursuing a stag, his horse stumbled. It was a minor event, a slip on wet leaves, something that had happened 100 times before. But this time the king was thrown. He did not break a bone. There was no visible wound, but something inside him broke. He suffered what his physicians would later describe as a wasting sickness, but what modern minds might call a stroke. He was carried back to his palace at Fontainebleau, the great hunter now helpless quarry for an invisible pursuer. For weeks he lingered. The most powerful man in Europe, who had stared down popes and emperors, was reduced to a speechless invalid, his eyes vacant, his iron will dissolved. He died on November 29, 1314, well within the 1-year limit set from a pillar of fire. The curse was fulfilled. The kingdom fell into the hands of his quarreling sons, a dynasty that would collapse within a generation, plunging France into the 100 Years' War. The legacy Philip fought to build was ash. His prophecy had been terrifyingly, precisely accurate. His vengeance, it seemed, was complete. But for those few who understood the deeper secrets of the temple, a more chilling question remained. The deaths of a pope and a king were a public spectacle, a settling of a worldly score. But what of the true crime Philip had committed? He had tried to seize not just the Templars' gold, but their knowledge, the contents of their secret archives. He had failed. The curse had removed the two men who knew the most about the Templars' public operations, but the real secret, the Aramaic scroll, remained hidden. Its guardians were dead, but its protectors were scattered and silent. Had curse been a final, brilliant misdirection, a public act of vengeance to distract the world from the quiet escape of a truth far more dangerous than any king or pope? The world saw an ending, but the real story was simply waiting for its next chapter, hidden once more in the shadows of history. The world saw an ending written in fire and blood. A pope consumed by flames, a king struck down in his prime, a dynasty left to wither on the vine. For the common man, for the chroniclers, for the squabbling nobles of France, the story of the Knights Templar concluded on that island in the Seine. Justice, or perhaps vengeance, had been served, but in the hushed scriptoriums of a few scattered monasteries and the secret ledgers of certain banking houses in Lombardy, a different accounting was being made. The curse was not an ending. It was a clearing of the board, a brutal and brilliant piece of stagecraft that drew all eyes to the collapsing French throne, while the real prize was quietly moved off stage. The kingdom Philip had forged with an iron will begin to dissolve like salt in water. His firstborn son, Louis X, inherited a crown but not his father's cunning. His brief reign was a tapestry of famine and incompetence. The Great Famine of 1315 settled over the land not as a tragedy, but as a judgment. Rain fell relentlessly for 2 years, turning fields to swampland and rotting seed in the earth. The price of grain spiraled into fantasy. People ate their horses, their dogs, then the bark from trees. The air in Paris, once thick with the smoke of spire, was now heavy with the smell of wet rot and starvation, a miasma of decay that clung to the very stones of the Louvre. Louis, nicknamed the Quarrelsome, watched his kingdom starve while he feuded with his barons. His heir, John I, born after his death, lived only 5 days, a king for a week, whose tiny coffin was a final, damning symbol of the Capetian line's mortality. The curse was not just killing kings, it was devouring their future. While the royal houses of Europe watched the French throne pass from one doomed brother to the next, from Philip V, who seized power by inventing a law to disinherit his niece, to Charles IV, the last of the direct line, both dying young and without sons. The true inheritors of the Templar legacy were silent. They were ghosts, men who had walked out of the records, men like the preceptor of France arrested alongside, yet his name simply vanishes from the meticulous interrogation logs. The official account is silent, a blank page where a confession or an execution should be. But in the fragmented whispers that passed between former Templar sergeants and friendly merchants, a different story was told. A story of a carefully planned escape, of a high-ranking master spirited away from the dungeons of Paris by a network that Philip's spies could never unravel. These scattered survivors were not an army seeking retribution. The fire on the Seine had served that purpose with an efficacy that bordered on the divine. Their mission was now one of pure preservation. They were librarians of a forbidden history, moving not with swords but with ink and parchment. While France bled, they consolidated. While kings plotted, they traveled. They were accountants closing a celestial ledger, ensuring the most precious asset was secure. The chaos in France was their shield. The 100 Years' War, born from the very succession crisis Philip's hubris had created, would turn the attention of England and France inward for a century. A continental brawl that provided the perfect cover for the greatest secret in Christendom to disappear. Where could a truth that explosive be hidden? Not in a vault, not buried beneath a church. That was the old way, the way that had failed. The secret had to be hidden in plain sight. The gaze of the silent protectors turned outward, away from the rotting heart of Europe, towards the sea. To the one kingdom that had the papal bull. In Portugal, king, I had not persecuted the Templars. He had listened to their case, found them innocent, and offered them refuge. It was a stunning act of defiance against both the Pope in Avignon and the mighty King of France. For years negotiated with the compromised papacy, a patient political game. He argued that the Templars' assets in Portugal should not be seized by the Knights, but should be used to found a new order dedicated to the same purpose, the defense of the realm against the Moors. It was of diplomacy. In 1319, 5 years after his death, Pope John XXII, Clement's successor, finally relented. He issued the bull Ad Ex authorizing King to transfer all of the former Templar properties to a new, purely Portuguese brotherhood, the Military Order of Christ. On the surface, it was a simple rebranding. The red cross of the Templars was subtly altered, a white cross now inset within its crimson arms. Their headquarters was established at Castro, a fortress overlooking the Atlantic. The world saw a pragmatic king securing his borders. But the few who knew saw something else entirely. They saw a resurrection. The order was not dead. It had been given a new name, a new flag, and a new sanctuary at the very edge of the known world. The old men who had served under, and the ones who had seen the Aramaic scroll, were gone. A new generation had inherited the charge. They understood that the future was not in Jerusalem, a land lost to them, but across the uncharted waters their new headquarters faced. The archives, the maps of strange coastlines compiled from merchants in eastern ports, the astronomical knowledge that far surpassed common European understanding, all of it flowed not to Avignon or Rome, but to the quiet harbors of Portugal. Though the bloodline, the living testament to a different history, was safe, it had found a new set of guardians, an order of knights who now looked not to the east, but to the west, towards the endless expanse of the Atlantic. They were no longer guarding a road to a holy city. They were preparing to build a new world. The curse had given them the time they needed. The question now was, what would they do with it?